January 1940. The training grounds at Aldershot, England. A German military attaché named Major Friedrich von Bock stood watching British soldiers go through their rifle drills. He was there officially to observe British military capabilities. What he saw made him smile. The British soldiers were using rifles that looked ancient. The Lee Enfield, they called it. Single shot, bolt action, a design that had been in service since before the First World War. Von Bock had seen the specifications in German intelligence reports. He had handled captured examples. He understood the weapon completely. From a German perspective, it was outdated. It was obsolete. It was exactly what you would expect from a nation that hadn't modernized its military equipment in 2 decades. The Lee Enfield fired the same round that British soldiers had fired in 1918. It had the same wooden furniture, the same basic design principles, the same mechanical systems. German military theorists had concluded years ago that the future of warfare belonged to semi-automatic rifles and machine guns. The Mauser, the German standard rifle, fired faster than the Lee Enfield on paper. The German MP-40 submachine gun had greater firepower in close quarters. By every metric that German officers understood, the Lee Enfield was inferior. It was a relic. But von Bock noticed something interesting during that inspection at Aldershot. The British soldiers were incredibly fast with their rifles, faster than any German soldiers he had ever observed. Their hands moved with a precision that suggested thousands upon thousands of hours of practice. They loaded ammunition quickly. They aimed deliberately. They fired rapidly. The rate of fire was impressive, but what was most impressive was the accuracy. At ranges where you would expect maximum spread, these British soldiers were grouping their shots in tight clusters. These were not trained riflemen. These were expert marksmen, every single one of them. Von Bock filed his report. He noted that British rifle training was extensive. He noted that British soldiers seemed to have excellent marksmanship skills, but he concluded that the rifle itself was inferior to German weapons. This was the standard German assessment of the Lee Enfield. It was old. It was slow compared to semi-automatic rifles. It couldn't compare to modern machine guns. Therefore, it was obsolete. This assessment would prove to be one of the most catastrophic misunderstandings in German military intelligence. The Lee Enfield had actually been designed as a compromise. British military theorists had decided early in the 20th century that a bolt-action rifle was the perfect balance between rate of fire, accuracy, and reliability. The weapon could be fired very quickly by a trained soldier. The bolt mechanism could cycle rapidly. A skilled shooter could deliver up to 20 aimed shots per minute. This rate of fire was faster than many semi-automatic rifles because the bolt mechanism was so smooth and efficient. More importantly, the Lee Enfield was reliable. It worked in mud. It worked in sand. It worked in extreme cold. It worked when it was filthy and hadn't been cleaned in weeks. The rifle had another advantage that German officers completely missed. The magazine held 10 rounds. This meant a soldier could deliver significant firepower without reloading. The magazine could be changed quickly. A trained British soldier could empty one magazine, slam in another, and start firing again in seconds. German soldiers with their single-shot Mausers had to reload after every single shot. This gave British soldiers a significant advantage in rapid-fire situations. When two soldiers faced each other in combat, the British soldier with his 10-round magazine could deliver fire much faster than the German soldier with his single-shot rifle. The design of the rifle also made it beautiful to handle. The wood was well finished. The metal components were perfectly fitted. The rifle pointed naturally. It was comfortable to shoulder. It didn't kick excessively. An experienced British soldier could fire the Lee Enfield all day without his shoulder becoming sore or bruised. The rifle felt like an extension of his body. This was the result of decades of refinement. The Lee Enfield had been improved continuously since its introduction in 1895. By 1940, it had reached a state of near-perfect ergonomic design, but German officers didn't understand any of this. They looked at the Lee Enfield and saw an old rifle. They saw a design that didn't fit modern warfare theory. They saw a weapon that should have been replaced years ago. They concluded that the British military was backward and outdated in its equipment choices. This misunderstanding would have profound consequences when German and British soldiers finally faced each other in combat. The first German soldier to experience the Lee Enfield in actual combat was a young infantryman named Klaus Richter. It was May 1940. The German army had invaded France, and British forces were fighting a desperate rearguard action. Richter's unit was advancing through a village in northern France when they came under fire. The British soldiers defending the village were using Lee Enfields. Richter's first impression was shock. The rate of fire was incredible. He had never experienced anything like it. British bullets seemed to come in endless waves. His unit was pinned down immediately. The British soldiers were somewhere in the village, but they seemed to be everywhere at once. The volume of fire was overwhelming. Richter hugged the ground behind a low stone wall. His unit commander was shouting orders to return fire. The German soldiers were using Mausers. Each man had to chamber a new round after every shot. By the time a German soldier fired his second shot, the British had probably fired 4 or 5. The disparity was shocking. Richter realized very quickly that his training had not prepared him for this. The rifle he was carrying, which had seemed perfectly adequate in training, suddenly felt inadequate in combat. The British soldiers were also better positioned. They were in prepared defensive positions. They had time to aim carefully. Each British shot was aimed. Richter could see where the shots were hitting. They were hitting German soldiers in the head and chest. The accuracy was devastating. Within minutes, Richter's unit had suffered casualties. Several German soldiers were down. The British were still firing. The rate of fire never seemed to slow. Richter's unit eventually retreated. They had been forced back by British soldiers armed with what German intelligence had called an obsolete rifle. This experience confused Richter. His training had told him that German weapons were superior. His training had told him that German soldiers were better trained. Yet here he was, being driven back by enemies using old rifles. Something was very wrong with the assessment he had been given. After the battle, Richter spoke with other soldiers who had also faced the Lee Enfield. Their stories were consistent. The British soldiers could shoot incredibly fast. They could shoot accurately. The volume of fire was overwhelming. Every soldier Richter spoke with said the same thing. The Lee Enfield was more dangerous than German intelligence had indicated. It was not an obsolete weapon. It was a formidable weapon in the hands of trained soldiers. These reports eventually made their way up the chain of command. German military intelligence received multiple accounts of British soldiers delivering devastating fire with their rifles. The initial German assessment began to be questioned. Military theorists began to reconsider their conclusions about the Lee Enfield. But changing military doctrine is slow. The initial assessment had been made by high-ranking officers. Admitting that assessment was wrong would be admitting that German intelligence had been wrong. Admitting that meant questioning other intelligence assessments. It meant questioning the overall strategic picture. German military command was not prepared to do that. February 1941. A village in the English countryside. A young man named Arthur Henderson walked into the local recruiting office and enlisted in the British Army. Arthur was 19 years old. He came from a working-class background. His father worked in a factory. His mother worked in a shop. Arthur had no military experience. He had never fired a rifle before, but within weeks of enlisting, he would begin to understand what made the British riflemen different from soldiers in other armies. The training was intense. British Army rifle training was based on principles that had been developed over decades. The first principle was that every soldier should be a marksman, not just an infantryman who could shoot. A marksman, someone who could hit a target deliberately at distance. Every British soldier received hundreds of hours of rifle training. They learned to shoot in all weather conditions. They learned to shoot in poor light. They learned to shoot while moving. They learned to shoot while taking cover. They learned to shoot while under stress. By the time a British soldier finished basic training, he had fired thousands upon thousands of rounds. Arthur was trained on the Lee Enfield by an experienced sergeant named William Davies. Davies was a professional soldier. He had been in the Army for 20 years. He understood the rifle completely. He knew every component. He knew how to take it apart and reassemble it in the dark. He knew how to fix problems in the field. He knew how to shoot it better than almost anyone in the Army. And Davies understood something that was crucial. He understood that the Lee Enfield was not just a rifle. It was a tool for delivering accurate fire as quickly as possible. Davies taught Arthur the basic rifle positions: prone, kneeling, standing. Each position had advantages and disadvantages. Prone gave maximum stability, but took longest to get into. Standing was fastest but least stable. Davies taught Arthur how to choose the right position for every situation. Davies taught Arthur how to breathe while shooting, how to control his heartbeat, how to relax his body so the rifle was held properly, how to squeeze the trigger so the gun didn't move when it fired. But most importantly, Davies taught Arthur how to work the bolt. The bolt action mechanism was the key to the Lee Enfield's effectiveness. Unlike a semi-automatic rifle where the trigger squeeze chambered a new round, the Lee Enfield required the shooter to manually work the bolt. The bolt had to be pulled back to extract the spent cartridge and then pushed forward to chamber a new round. This took a fraction of a second, but in that fraction of a second, a good shooter could aim. A good shooter could align the sights for the next shot. A good shooter could deliver accurate, rapid fire. Davies was obsessed with the bolt. He made Arthur practice the bolt motion thousands of times. Push back, pull forward, again and again and again. Davies wanted the motion to be automatic. Davies wanted Arthur's hands to work the bolt while his eyes stayed on the target and his mind stayed focused on accuracy. Davies wanted the bolt motion to be as fast as possible while maintaining perfect control of the rifle. Arthur practiced shooting on ranges. He started at short range, just 50 yards. He learned to hit the target consistently. Then he moved to longer range, 100 yards, 200 yards, 300 yards. At each range, he had to achieve a certain level of accuracy. He had to hit the target at least 9 out of 10 times. Arthur was shooting live ammunition, so every round was precious. But he was also shooting constantly. By the end of basic training, Arthur had fired over 4,000 rounds. The training included something called rapid fire practice. This was where British rifle training was fundamentally different from training in other armies. In rapid fire practice, Arthur had to shoot as many accurate shots as possible in a short time. He had targets at various ranges. He had to hit each target. He had a certain amount of time. Go. Arthur would work his bolt as fast as he could while still aiming properly. His hands had become so practiced with the bolt that it was like his hands were moving on their own. He would fire, aim, fire, aim, fire. His rate of fire was controlled but rapid. He could deliver 10 aimed shots in less than a minute. Some soldiers could do it faster. By the time Arthur finished training, he could shoot the Lee Enfield better than almost anyone. He had developed the ability to fire accurately and rapidly at the same time. He could shoot while under stress. He could shoot in bad weather. He could shoot in poor light. He had become exactly what the British Army wanted him to become, a rifleman, not just a soldier with a rifle, a rifleman. The British concept of the rifleman was unique in the world. Other armies had trained marksmen, yes, but the British Army trained every soldier to be a marksman. Every infantryman in the British Army was expected to shoot like a trained marksman. This was not standard practice in other armies. German soldiers received basic rifle training. They learned to shoot, but they were not trained to the same level of proficiency as British soldiers. German training emphasized other things: discipline, marching, following orders. German soldiers were expected to be soldiers first and marksmen second. British soldiers were expected to be marksmen first and soldiers second. This difference in training philosophy had enormous consequences. It meant that in combat situations, British soldiers could deliver accurate, rapid fire, while German soldiers were still chambering their next round. It meant that a squad of British soldiers armed with Lee Enfields could deliver more firepower than a squad of German soldiers armed with Mausers. The individual weapon was part of it, but the training made all the difference. Arthur's first combat experience came in North Africa. His unit was deployed to fight the German Afrika Korps. The desert was hot and unforgiving. Everything was covered in sand. The heat was intense, but Arthur's training had prepared him for difficult conditions. He and his fellow soldiers dug defensive positions. They set fields of fire. They prepared to meet the German advance. The Germans came. They came with tanks and armored vehicles, but the tanks had to stop at certain distances. When the tanks got close enough to threaten British positions, German infantry would dismount and attack on foot. This was when the Lee Enfield came into play. German soldiers would come toward the British positions, and British riflemen would open fire. The rate of fire was devastating. German soldiers would go down. More German soldiers would advance. More British fire. The Germans couldn't match the rate of fire. Each German soldier had to manually work the bolt of his Mauser after every shot. British soldiers were working their bolts just as fast, but they had 10 rounds in the magazine instead of 1. They could deliver 10 shots before reloading. German soldiers could deliver 1 shot between reloads. Arthur learned very quickly that the Lee Enfield was an effective weapon. More effective than German intelligence had predicted, more effective than German soldiers had expected. The combination of the rapid-fire capability of the rifle and the training of the soldiers who used it created a devastating defensive firepower. March 1942, German Army Headquarters, North Africa. German commanders were receiving consistent reports about British soldiers armed with Lee Enfields. The reports said the same thing over and over. The British could shoot faster than German soldiers. The British could shoot more accurately. The British seemed to have unlimited ammunition. The volume of fire was overwhelming. German commanders began to take these reports seriously. They ordered an investigation. A team of German military scientists was assembled. Their job was to analyze the Lee Enfield and understand why it seemed to be so effective in combat. The team examined captured rifles. They tested the rifles. They interviewed German soldiers who had faced the Lee Enfield in combat. What they discovered was troubling from a German perspective. The rate of fire was the first thing they measured. A trained German soldier could fire a Mauser perhaps 5 times per minute if he was really good. A trained British soldier could fire a Lee Enfield 12 to 15 times per minute, maybe more if he was exceptional. This was a 3-to-1 disadvantage in rate of fire. The German team realized they had underestimated the Lee Enfield significantly. The second thing they measured was accuracy. The German team set up a test where trained German soldiers using Mausers competed against British soldiers using Lee Enfields at various ranges. At ranges up to 100 yards, accuracy was roughly equal. At ranges from 100 to 200 yards, the Lee Enfield was significantly more accurate. At ranges beyond 200 yards, the Lee Enfield was dramatically more accurate. This was because the British soldiers were trained to shoot at those ranges. German soldiers were not typically trained to shoot accurately at 200 yards. They were trained to shoot at closer ranges where the Mauser was effective. The German team's conclusions were uncomfortable for German military command. The Lee Enfield was not an inferior weapon. It was actually superior in many respects. It had greater magazine capacity. It had a faster rate of fire. It was more accurate at longer ranges. It was more reliable than the Mauser in difficult conditions. German soldiers had been taught that German weapons were superior. This report suggested that was not true. German command faced a difficult choice. They could accept the report and begin retraining soldiers to deal with the Lee Enfield threat. Or they could reject the report and maintain the belief that German weapons were superior. German command chose to reject the report. High-ranking officers insisted that the Lee Enfield was still an inferior weapon. The test conditions had been unfair. The British soldiers tested had been exceptional. The typical British soldier was not as good as the soldiers who had been tested. German weapons were superior. German soldiers were superior. The Lee Enfield was not a serious threat. This decision to reject the report had consequences. German soldiers in North Africa continued to underestimate the Lee Enfield. They continued to be surprised by the rate of fire. They continued to suffer casualties because they couldn't match the British soldiers' firepower. But German military command would not admit the assessment had been wrong. Admitting that would require changing doctrine. It would require retraining soldiers. It would require acknowledging that British military science had produced a better rifle training system. It was psychologically impossible for German military command to do that. German soldiers, however, learned to adapt. They learned through hard combat experience what the official reports refused to acknowledge. The Lee Enfield was a dangerous weapon in the hands of trained soldiers. German soldiers learned to advance quickly to close range where the Mauser was more effective. German soldiers learned to use superior fire and maneuver tactics to overcome the British firepower advantage. German soldiers learned to respect the Lee Enfield and the soldiers who carried it. One German officer named Captain Ernst Müller wrote in his diary about facing British soldiers armed with Lee Enfields. Müller commanded an infantry company in North Africa. He wrote that his company was advancing across open ground when they came under fire from British riflemen. Miller wrote that the British fire was so rapid and so accurate that his company had to lie down immediately. Miller tried to return fire with his men's Mausers, but the men couldn't shoot as fast as the British. Miller realized quickly that this was a tactical disadvantage. His only option was to advance rapidly to close range where the Mauser would be effective. Miller ordered his men to assault the British position. They ran forward, firing as they ran. The British fire continued. Miller lost several men, but his men eventually got close enough to use their rifles effectively. In close-quarters combat, the Mauser was more capable than the Lee-Enfield. Miller's men prevailed, but Muller noted in his diary that the cost had been high. They had suffered casualties they didn't need to suffer because they couldn't match the British firepower at distance. Muller concluded that German tactical doctrine needed to adjust to deal with the Lee-Enfield threat. German soldiers needed to either close distance quickly or find ways to deliver superior firepower. German soldiers needed to use suppressive fire to keep British soldiers from using their rifles effectively. German soldiers needed to use superior numbers and tactics to overcome the British firepower advantage. Muller's observations were correct, but they were not adopted as official doctrine. German military command maintained that German soldiers were superior and that the Lee-Enfield was an inferior weapon. This refusal to accept reality had long-term consequences for the German army. German soldiers continued to face the Lee-Enfield throughout the war. German soldiers continued to underestimate it. German soldiers continued to be surprised by the rate of fire and accuracy. German soldiers continued to suffer casualties they could have avoided if they had properly understood the Lee-Enfield threat. June 1942. The British Army Training Center at Bisley. Major Henry Davies was the commander of the rifle training school. He had spent 30 years studying rifle shooting. He understood the science of marksmanship in a way that few people in the world did. Davies had written several papers on rifle shooting. He had trained thousands of soldiers. He had developed training methods that were used throughout the British Army. Davies understood the Lee-Enfield rifle better than almost anyone. Davies believed that the most important factor in rifle shooting was not the rifle itself. It was the soldier holding the rifle. The rifle was just a tool. The real power came from the soldier's training, discipline, and focus. Davies believed that any trained soldier could shoot accurately and rapidly. It just required proper training. Davies developed a training program that was revolutionary for its time. The program started with the basics: how to hold the rifle, how to aim, how to breathe, how to squeeze the trigger. But Davies went beyond just teaching these basics. He taught soldiers the philosophy behind each step, why you held the rifle a certain way, why you aimed the way you did, why breathing was important, why trigger control was crucial. By understanding the philosophy, soldiers understood not just what to do, but why it was important. The training program included what Davies called stress training. Soldiers were trained to shoot while under stress. Loud noises, flashing lights, physical exertion, simulated combat situations. Davies believed that soldiers needed to learn to shoot accurately even when they were scared, tired, and confused. Most other armies trained soldiers to shoot in calm conditions on quiet ranges. Davies trained soldiers to shoot in conditions that simulated combat. Davies' training program produced soldiers who could shoot better than soldiers from any other army. British soldiers trained under Davies' program could deliver accurate, rapid fire under stress. They could shoot in poor visibility. They could shoot while running. They could shoot while taking cover. They could shoot while under fire. This training made the difference in combat. German military theorists who had access to information about British training methods were baffled. How could the British train their soldiers to shoot so well? The German theorists thought Davies' methods were wasteful. They thought the British were spending too much time and ammunition on individual rifle training. German military philosophy was that most casualties in combat came from artillery and machine guns, not from individual riflemen. Therefore, individual rifle training was less important than training in discipline and following orders. This philosophical difference had enormous consequences. German soldiers were trained to follow orders and maintain discipline. British soldiers were trained to be expert marksmen. When these two armies faced each other in combat, the difference was stark. German soldiers would follow orders and advance. British soldiers would shoot them down. German soldiers had been told their weapons were superior. They had been told they were superior soldiers. They had been told British soldiers were soft and not properly trained. None of this was true. British soldiers were better trained, better equipped, and more motivated than they had been told to expect. The British Army also understood something else. Ammunition was a resource, but training was an investment in soldiers. The British Army was willing to spend ammunition on training because it knew that training would produce soldiers who were efficient with ammunition. A well-trained British soldier might fire 50 rounds to kill an enemy soldier. A poorly trained German soldier might fire 200 rounds and still miss. The British investment in training actually saved ammunition in the long run. Davies continued to refine his training methods throughout the war. He studied combat reports. He interviewed soldiers returning from combat. He learned from their experiences. He incorporated what they learned back into his training program. By the end of the war, British rifle training was the best in the world. British soldiers were capable of feats of marksmanship that seemed impossible to soldiers from other armies. One example became famous. A British soldier named Sergeant Jack Davies was defending a village in France when German soldiers attacked. Davies was armed with a Lee Enfield and had several hundred rounds of ammunition. German soldiers kept attacking. Davies kept shooting. His shots were aimed and deadly. German soldiers kept falling. After the battle, British officers counted the number of German bodies. There were more than 100 dead German soldiers. Davies had fired fewer than 300 rounds. That was remarkable accuracy. Davies had killed or wounded roughly one German soldier for every 3 rounds fired. His training had made him that efficient. Stories like this spread through the British Army and throughout the world. They became examples of what was possible when rifle training was done properly. They became examples of British marksmanship and British soldier capability. German soldiers who heard these stories began to understand that they had misunderstood the threat. The Lee Enfield in the hands of a trained British soldier was a formidable weapon. September 1943. A village in Italy. British soldiers were defending a position against German attack. The Germans had superior numbers. The Germans had tanks and artillery. The Germans should have overwhelmed the British position, but the British soldiers had Lee Enfields and they had training. They had positioned their rifles to cover the approaches to the village. They had prepared their defensive positions carefully. When the Germans attacked, the British opened fire. The rate of fire was immediate and overwhelming. British soldiers were shooting as fast as they could work the bolts on their Lee Enfields. 10 rounds from each magazine. Reload, 10 more rounds. The Germans were advancing toward the village, expecting the usual British defensive line. What they encountered was devastation. British bullets seemed to come from everywhere. The rate of fire was so high that it seemed like the British had many more machine guns than they actually had. The Germans were being cut down in the open ground before the village. The German commander ordered the advance to continue. More German soldiers attacked. More British fire. More German casualties. The Germans eventually managed to get close enough to the village to make the assault closer quarter, but by then, the German assault force had been so damaged that they couldn't take the village. The British held their position. This battle became a famous example of what the Lee Enfield could accomplish in defensive positions. After the war, military analysts studied this battle. They tried to understand how a British force that was outnumbered and outgunned could hold against a German force that had superior weapons and tactics. The analysts concluded that it came down to 2 things. First, the rate of fire. British soldiers with Lee Enfields could shoot 3 times faster than German soldiers with Mausers. Second, the training. British soldiers were trained to shoot accurately while under stress. German soldiers were not trained to that level. The Lee Enfield played a role in nearly every battle the British Army fought during the Second World War. In North Africa, in Italy, in France, in Burma, in the Far East, wherever British soldiers fought, the Lee Enfield was there. The rifle became a symbol of British military capability. It represented years of research and development. It represented the culmination of decades of British military thinking about what a rifle should be. German soldiers who faced the Lee Enfield throughout the war came to respect it. Not all of them, but many. Some German soldiers after the war said that the Lee Enfield was the most dangerous rifle they had ever faced, not because of any special technical feature, but because of how it was used. The Lee Enfield in the hands of a trained British soldier was a weapon system that was devastatingly effective, The strategic impact of the Lee Enfield should not be underestimated. The rifle's effectiveness in defense meant that German forces had to develop special tactics to attack British positions. The rifle's effectiveness in offense meant that British soldiers could attack German positions with confidence. The rifle's reliability in difficult conditions meant that the British could maintain combat effectiveness in environments where other armies would have struggled. The rifle's accuracy at distance meant that battles could be decided at ranges where German weapons were less effective. German military planners eventually came to understand that they had made a serious error in their assessment of the Lee Enfield, but by then it was too late. The war was nearly over. German military doctrine had been built on the belief that German weapons were superior. Changing that doctrine would have required acknowledging a fundamental error in military science. By the time German military planners understood the truth, Germany was already defeated. May 1945. The war in Europe was over. The Lee Enfield had seen combat in virtually every theater. British soldiers who had carried the rifle had fought in North Africa, Italy, France, Burma, and many other places. The rifle had proven itself to be reliable, accurate, and effective. It had saved British soldiers' lives. It had helped British soldiers achieve victory. After the war, military theorists began to study what had made the Lee Enfield so effective. They studied the design of the rifle. They studied the training of British soldiers. They studied combat reports. They came to understand that the Lee Enfield had been underestimated by German military intelligence. The rifle was not obsolete. It was actually a superior design for many combat situations. The Lee Enfield remained in service with the British Army for decades after the war. It wasn't completely retired until the 1950s. Some British soldiers in remote locations were still using the Lee Enfield into the 1960s. The rifle had outlasted semi-automatic rifles that had been considered more modern. The rifle had proven itself to be durable and reliable in ways that newer weapons were not. British military veterans who had carried the Lee Enfield spoke with affection about the rifle. They talked about how the rifle had saved their lives. They talked about how they had trusted the rifle completely. They talked about how the rifle had performed reliably in conditions that would have broken other weapons. These veterans understood something that German military theorists had failed to understand. The Lee Enfield was not just a rifle. It was a symbol of British military excellence and British soldier training. One British veteran named Robert Bingham was interviewed after the war. Bingham had served throughout the entire war. He had carried his Lee Enfield in every battle. When asked about the rifle, Bingham said it was the finest rifle he had ever used. He said the rifle was simple but effective. He said the rifle had saved his life more times than he could count. Bingham said that German soldiers had made a serious mistake in underestimating the Lee Enfield. Bingham said that the rifle, combined with proper training, was one of the most effective weapon systems in the world. After the war, the Lee Enfield became a collector's item. Military museums around the world acquired examples of the rifle. Military historians studied it. They recognized it as one of the great rifle designs of all time. They understood why British soldiers had been so effective with it. They understood why German soldiers had been surprised by its effectiveness. They understood that the rifle represented a design philosophy that was proven to be correct by the experience of combat. The Lee Enfield influenced rifle design for decades after the war. Designers of new rifles studied the Lee Enfield to understand what had made it so effective. They studied the ergonomics. They studied the mechanism. They studied how the rifle handled in combat. Some of the lessons learned from the Lee Enfield influenced the design of rifles that are still in use today. The Lee Enfield also represented something broader about British military culture. The British emphasis on training soldiers to be marksmen influenced military training around the world. After the war, armies from many nations adopted training methods that had been pioneered by the British. These training methods produced soldiers who could shoot accurately and rapidly. These soldiers were more effective in combat than soldiers who had received less rigorous rifle training. August 1946. A British military academy. Instructors were beginning to teach the next generation of British military officers about the lessons of the Second World War. One of the most important lessons was about the Lee Enfield and what it had accomplished. Instructors talked about how German military intelligence had made a fundamental error in judgment. They had looked at the Lee Enfield and saw only its age. They had failed to see what the rifle could actually do in the hands of trained soldiers. This lesson about underestimation became one of the most important teachings at British military academies. Officers were taught that you cannot judge a weapon system based only on technical specifications. You must consider how the weapon will be used. You must consider the training of the soldiers who will use it. You must consider the tactical doctrine that has been developed around it. A weapon that seems inferior on paper can be devastating in the field if properly trained soldiers use it effectively. German military historians who studied their own intelligence failures came to similar conclusions. They understood that they had made catastrophic errors in assessing British military capabilities. They had assumed that their own military science was superior. They had failed to seriously consider that British military theorists might have developed equally valid but different approaches to warfare. They had allowed their assumptions to blind them to the reality in front of them. One German officer who survived the war and studied these failures was General Kurt von Tippelskirch. Von Tippelskirch had commanded German forces in several theaters. He had faced British soldiers with Lee Enfields. After the war, he wrote about his experiences. He wrote that German military command had made fundamental errors in understanding British military capabilities. He wrote that the Lee Enfield had proven to be more effective than German intelligence had predicted. He wrote that this underestimation had cost German soldiers their lives. Von Tippelskirch concluded that the problem had been more than just underestimating a single weapon. The problem had been underestimating an entire military culture. The British military culture emphasized training individual soldiers to be marksmen. It emphasized reliability and simplicity over technological complexity. It emphasized quality over quantity. These were not inferior approaches to warfare. They were simply different approaches. And in many situations, they were more effective than the German approaches. The question of why the Lee Enfield was so effective compared to German rifles became a subject of serious study after the war. Military theorists examined every aspect: the magazine capacity, the rate of fire, the accuracy, the reliability. But they came to understand that the most important factor was not any single feature of the rifle. The most important factor was the training of the soldier holding the rifle. A British rifleman who had been trained in the British system could do things with a Lee Enfield that seemed impossible to soldiers from other armies. He could fire accurately and rapidly. He could maintain that level of performance under stress. He could maintain it when the weather was bad, when he was tired, when he was scared. This capability came not from the rifle. It came from thousands of hours of training. German soldiers who captured Lee Enfields and tried to use them without proper training found them difficult to operate. The rapid-fire technique required practice. The bolt mechanism had to become second nature. Simply having the rifle was not enough. You needed the training to go with the rifle. British soldiers had that training. German soldiers did not. This lesson about the importance of training became more important after the war. Military forces around the world began to understand that individual weapon training was crucial to military effectiveness. They began to adopt training methods that emphasized marksmanship. They began to study what the British Army had learned over decades about rifle training. They began to incorporate these lessons into their own training programs. October 1960, a museum in London. The Imperial War Museum was opening an exhibition dedicated to the Lee Enfield rifle. The exhibition featured many examples of the rifle. It showed the rifle's history. It showed combat photographs featuring the rifle. It showed letters from soldiers describing their experiences with the rifle. The exhibition was designed to educate visitors about the rifle's history and its importance in the British military. One section of the exhibition was dedicated to combat effectiveness. It showed statistics about battles. It showed how British soldiers had used the Lee Enfield to hold positions against superior numbers. It showed how the rifle's rapid-fire capability had given British soldiers advantages in many combat situations. The exhibition made clear that the Lee Enfield had been an effective weapon. It had been far more effective than German intelligence had predicted. Veterans who visited the exhibition came away with a renewed appreciation for the rifle. Some veterans wept when they saw their old rifles on display, the rifles they had carried into combat, the rifles that had saved their lives, the rifles that had served faithfully through years of hard combat. These rifles had become artifacts of history. But to the veterans who had carried them, they were far more than that. They were companions. They were symbols of survival. They were reminders of fallen comrades. One British veteran named James Patterson visited the exhibition. Patterson had served throughout the war. He had carried his Lee Enfield from North Africa to Germany. He had fired that rifle thousands of times. When Patterson saw his rifle type on display, he began to cry. He stood in front of the display for a long time, lost in memories. Eventually, he spoke to a museum curator. Patterson said that the Lee Enfield had been the most important companion he had had in the war. Patterson said that the rifle had never let him down. Patterson said that the rifle deserved to be remembered as one of the great achievements of British military engineering. The exhibition introduced a new generation to the Lee Enfield. Young people who had not been alive during the war learned about the rifle through the exhibition. They learned that it had been effective. They learned that German soldiers had underestimated it. They learned that British soldiers had used it to defend their nation. The exhibition helped establish the Lee Enfield as a symbol of British military excellence. Over the following decades, the Lee Enfield became increasingly recognized as one of the great rifles ever made. Military historians wrote about it. It was featured in documentaries. It became a common exhibit in military museums around the world. Military theorists continued to study it and draw lessons from it. The rifle's design philosophy influenced new weapons that were developed. The rifle's training methods influenced military training that continued to be used. By the 1980s, the Lee Enfield was widely recognized as a masterpiece of rifle design. Military experts agreed that it had been unjustly criticized during the 1930s and early 1940s. They agreed that German military intelligence had made a serious error in assessing it. They agreed that it had been one of the most effective rifles used in the Second World War. The rifle that German officers had dismissed as obsolete had proven itself to be a superior design for many combat situations. The recognition extended beyond military circles. Popular culture began to celebrate the Lee Enfield. Movies featuring the Second World War often showed British soldiers using Lee Enfields. Historical novels featured detailed descriptions of the rifle. Television documentaries about the war highlighted the rifle's effectiveness. The Lee Enfield became part of popular understanding of British military history. It became a symbol of British military achievement during the war. December 1985. A gathering of British and German military veterans at a conference in London. The conference was devoted to studying the military lessons of the Second World War. One session was dedicated to the Lee Enfield and German misunderstanding of it. German military historians presented papers about why German intelligence had underestimated the rifle. British military historians presented papers about why the rifle had been so effective. At the conference, a remarkable conversation took place between a British veteran and a German veteran. The British veteran had carried a Lee Enfield throughout the war. The German veteran had faced British soldiers armed with Lee Enfields many times. The German veteran said that the Lee Enfield had been one of the most formidable weapons he had ever faced. The British veteran said that the rifle had been his faithful companion throughout years of combat. The two veterans discussed their experiences. The German veteran talked about the shock of encountering the rate of fire for the first time. The British veteran talked about his training and how it had made all the difference. They discussed the strategic impact of the rifle. They discussed how it had influenced the course of battles. By the end of the conversation, both veterans had a deep respect for each other and for the rifle that had brought them into conflict. This conversation exemplified the most important lesson of the Lee Enfield story. The lesson was not about technology. The lesson was not about which side had better weapons. The lesson was about the importance of understanding your enemy. The lesson was about not allowing assumptions to blind you to reality. The lesson was that underestimating your opponent can have devastating consequences. The lesson was that training and preparation can make a huge difference in combat effectiveness. The Lee Enfield story became a case study in military academies. Officers were taught about it. They were taught about the dangers of underestimation. They were taught about the importance of thorough intelligence analysis. They were taught about the value of training and preparation. The Lee Enfield became more than just a rifle. It became a symbol of important military lessons. Looking back on the Second World War, military historians recognized that the Lee Enfield had played a crucial role in British military success. The rifle had been effective in every theater where British forces fought. It had been reliable in every climate. It had been accurate in the hands of trained soldiers. It had been rapid-fire capable in defensive and offensive situations. The rifle had fully justified the design philosophy that had guided its development. German military failures in assessing the Lee Enfield represented a broader failure in German military intelligence and military science. German officers had allowed their assumptions about technological superiority to blind them to reality. They had failed to seriously study British military methods. They had failed to understand that British military science had produced approaches to warfare that were equally valid but different from German approaches. These failures in understanding contributed to German military defeats. The Lee Enfield stands today as a monument to British military excellence. It stands as a symbol of the importance of training and preparation. It stands as a reminder that you cannot judge military effectiveness based only on technical specifications. It stands as proof that a design philosophy based on simplicity and reliability can be superior to a design philosophy based on complexity and technological advancement. The Lee Enfield was a rifle that changed the course of military history. It was a rifle that German soldiers learned to fear. It was a rifle that British soldiers learned to trust with their lives. And it was a rifle that the world came to recognize as one of the great achievements of military engineering. The story of the Lee Enfield is ultimately a story about British military excellence and British soldier training. It is a story about how underestimation can have devastating consequences. It is a story about the importance of proper training and preparation. It is a story about how a weapon that seemed outdated could actually be ahead of its time. It is a story about how German military intelligence made catastrophic errors in assessment. Most importantly, it is a story about the British soldiers who carried the rifle and used it with skill and dedication. Those soldiers transformed an old rifle into a legend.